for the class transcendent. The question is a building into the larger question of this topic for the week is how to understand indigenous or the pre-colonial religions of Africa. It is a piece of understanding African culture. It is a piece of understanding the background and heritage of the people who were enslaved and transported from Africa as slaves to the United States and the Western Hemisphere, that religious legacy as well. But I want to set the scene for this, and this is a relatively short presentation this morning. I want to ask you to do some research on your own for the rest of the hour. Here's the question. So we know that Africa is the cradle of humanity. All of the archaeological and anthropological, paleontological information suggests that the humans first emerged from the continent of Africa and spread from there. What we don't know for sure, and has been what has been left in misty, strange myths and misunderstandings, is whether those people in that era continues to be primitive, or whether it developed over the period of eons, thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. Did it develop into civilizations? That would make the characterization of their religions very different. See, were those people sophisticated in the sense of civilized, or were they primitive tribes people? Now, and what we're talking about is the time before the European colonization or discovery. That happened around the 1400s of the Common Era, around the time that the European nations had grown strong and their kingdoms were independent and had enough wealth that they could develop shipbuilding and military to be able to explore beyond Europe and use that for economic resourcing. What happened before that? So for the argument, for the game I want to play today, and that we'll follow up on, I want you to report on Wednesday, is assume, of course fictionally, assume that I'm one of those people who believes that the Africans who were brought to this country, who are the ancestors of the African Americans, the blacks of our communities and of our nation, were basically primitive people who had very little in the way of education, culture, I've been reinforced in that belief by all of the crazy imagery of African cultures and African tribes that has been in the popular media and movies and television that shows these African tribes as primitives. That perspective was reinforced and was begun by a character by the name of Leo Africanus in the 1400s, who was taken as a slave from Africa, sent to Europe for education, became a Christian, and wrote and went back to Africa to study the African culture, and wrote back that the African people were basically animals. They had no education or wisdom or reason. They couldn't think. They couldn't They didn't have any intellectual sophistication. They had no art. They had no civilized religion. They had no governance, and they were these primitive, pre-developed peoples. Sidebar: what we're going to be thinking about was that a Eurocentric perspective on what is civilization? Now, what I want you to so the idea of primitive. Here's the definition of primitive. A primitive society is one that is, by definition, simple. It does not have an elaborate written language. It doesn't have any science. It has a worldview that is based on nature, and the religion is also nature-based, worshiping the sun and the moon and the animals. It is ruled by autocratic chieftains in small groups, not centralized, centrally located, hidden in the bush or the jungle. That's primitive, pre-civilized. Now, you can look it up for yourself. The definition that I'm going for civilized comes from the National Geographic, which studies things of the world. A civilized culture or peoples have some urban settings. They have enough resources to gather people in large groups of people in cities and towns. It has a central government with a ruling structure that enables peace in the land, in the kingdom, in the empire. It has a common religion that everybody pretty much adheres to. They have other religions, subordinates, but usually has a common religion that everybody adheres to. It has plenty of natural resources and economic stability and wealth. Could be the natural resources of agriculture. It could be the natural resources of gold and other hard and soft precious metals, and of course natural resources of human ingenuity as well. And it has a science, and I lay these out in the discussion sections. It has some way of understanding the world that is relatively sophisticated. That is, we understand why the world works, and we explore that and continually expand our way of understanding the world. Now, what I want you to do, in following up on this, I've given you a map, like the one that's here on my board, on the discussion page under this module, of the empires of Africa. The pre-colonial, that is before the 1400s of Africa. There are about a dozen of them. What I want you to do is to be able to try to argue, debate, refute my assertion that Africans up to the 1400s and European incursion were all primitive. They were not civilized. I want you to ask, were any of or some of these empires civilized? Had they developed an advanced, what we might call a progressive civilization of some kind? I want you to pick one of them. There's a whole list of them there. There's the Egyptian, there's the Berber, there's the Mali, there's the Zimbabwean, there's the Congo, and others. Pick one and look it up. So first I want you to look up again the definitions of primitive and civilized. Then look up one of these empires. Get its history. What period of time did it exist? Excuse me. Um, what was going on in an empire? What had they done to develop a government, urban centers, science, commerce, religion, uh, art and architecture? Had they done any of those things? And I want you to be able to come in and very briefly at the beginning of our Zoom class on Wednesday, I want you to present an argument as to whether or not the peoples of Africa around 1400 of this Common Era were indeed primitive or civilized. Then we'll go from that and a brief conversation about that. We'll go from that to talk about what are the basics of the religions of Africa in general. And I'll be wanting you to read the portions of the chapter in Kelly Brown Douglas's Stand Your Ground book, page 143, 4, 5, whatever it is, to 156, where she describes in general, a generic sense of religions in pre-colonial Africa that are still alive today in many cases. What are the characteristics of those religions? And we will consider again whether that's a viable understanding, categorized as a world religion or a set of world religions that we can consider along Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and so forth. So look those things up, discover what you can, be prepared to argue that, read the passage. There's also a video in this module of practices of indigenous African religions that you can look at for further information. I've also offered you a video, an article about the religious culture of the fictional empire of Wakanda that has a lot of interesting things to suggest for our conversation on Wednesday. So you can do as much of that as you can before Wednesday. We'll talk about it. Then there's a paper, the usual one-page summary of your reading and studies due on Friday for this week. That is what I want you to do. You can spend the rest of your time that you would have spent in class. These simple 13 minutes have taken only a small part of it. Get to work, get some research, have some fun. Let's talk about it on Wednesday. Thank you.